In a quiet suburb where the streets were lined with identical houses and children's laughter echoed in the evenings, Daniel Harris lived what many would describe as the perfect life. His lawn was always trimmed, his car washed every Saturday morning, and his family appeared happy when they stepped out together. To the outside world, Daniel was dependable, reliable, and steady. Neighbors nodded in admiration, often commenting on how lucky his wife Emily must be to have a man so devoted to her and their home. But beneath the surface of that carefully maintained image, a storm was building. Daniel carried a secret that grew heavier with each passing day, one that would eventually consume everyone around him. Daniel had been involved in an affair for almost a year. It wasn't something he had planned, nor was it the result of some dramatic unhappiness at home. It began with small moments at the office. Lingering glances, conversations that stretched a little too long, and the thrill of someone outside his marriage giving him attention he hadn't felt in years. Soon, what started as harmless flirtation grew into something much darker. He would stay late at work, claiming deadlines kept him tied to his desk, when in reality, he was slipping away to meet another woman. At first, he justified it to himself as harmless, convinced he could keep his two lives separate. But affairs have a way of spilling over, and Daniel's carefully guarded secret began leaving traces that others couldn't ignore. Emily, his wife, didn't notice at first. She was busy with her own routines, managing the house, raising their child, and maintaining the comfortable rhythm of family life. She trusted Daniel implicitly, and never questioned his late nights or the extra business trips he claimed were necessary. But her mother, Margaret, saw things differently. Margaret visited often, never needing an invitation, as she believed it was her duty to look out for her daughter and granddaughter. She knew Daniel well, or at least she thought she did, and something about his behavior unsettled her. He seemed distracted, irritable, and more distant than she remembered. Small signs that might seem insignificant to others stood out sharply to her. A man who once came home eagerly now looked restless in his own living room. His phone was always face down, and his explanations for late returns seemed rehearsed. Margaret was not the kind of woman to dismiss her instincts. She had lived long enough to know when someone was hiding something. The subtle glances, the nervous fidgeting, the sudden defensiveness. It was all too familiar. She didn't say anything directly to Emily, not yet, but she began watching Daniel more closely. She noticed receipts tucked away in his car's glove compartment, from restaurants Emily had never mentioned visiting. She caught the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on his shirt one evening. She even saw him once across town in a cafe, sitting with a woman she didn't recognize, leaning in closer than a married man should. Each discovery added weight to her suspicions until they became undeniable. Margaret's growing certainty about Daniel's secret began to change the atmosphere in the Harris household. Though Emily remained unaware, Margaret's cold stares and clipped tone around Daniel made him increasingly uneasy. He could sense that she was onto him, that she was collecting pieces of a puzzle he had worked so hard to keep hidden. And the more he noticed her watchful eyes, the more paranoid he became. In his mind, Margaret wasn't just suspicious, she was dangerous. She represented exposure, and exposure meant everything he had built could collapse in an instant. Daniel's reputation was not just about appearances, it was his shield. He believed that if Emily discovered the affair, his marriage would end, his finances would crumble, and the stable image he had crafted for his community would be destroyed. He would no longer be the man people respected. The thought of losing control terrified him. Yet, instead of ending the affair or coming clean, Daniel chose to protect himself through darker thoughts. He began to see Margaret not as a mother-in-law, not as family, but as an enemy standing in the way of his survival. The terrifying shift happened slowly, but unmistakably. Margaret's presence at the house, once a routine part of family life, now felt suffocating to him. Every time she walked in the door, Daniel's stomach tightened with dread. Every question she asked seemed loaded. Every look she gave him felt like an accusation. He imagined her cornering Emily with the truth, dismantling the careful story he had created. And the more he imagined it, the more desperate he felt to stop it from happening. On the surface, nothing had changed. The family continued with their daily lives, neighbors still waved, and from the outside, their home looked as ordinary as ever. But behind closed doors, the tension was growing, a silent war playing out in glances and suspicions. Daniel's secret had already poisoned the family, and though no one knew it yet, the consequences of Margaret's awareness would soon turn catastrophic. Margaret's instincts refused to let her rest. The more she watched Daniel, the more convinced she became that something was seriously wrong. He no longer resembled the calm, steady man she once believed he was. His routines had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. He returned home at odd hours, sometimes with no clear explanation, other times with vague excuses that trailed off under her sharp gaze. He was restless, pacing the house as though he carried an invisible weight on his shoulders. And when Emily would ask harmless questions, he would answer with an edge of irritation that seemed out of proportion. Margaret didn't need hard proof. The signs were enough to tell her that he was hiding a secret. Quietly, she began piecing things together in her own way. Margaret had lived through her share of heartbreak and betrayal in her lifetime. She knew what dishonesty looked like, even in its smallest form, so she sharpened her attention. On her visits, she inspected Daniel's behavior closely, her eyes catching what Emily's trusting nature overlooked. She began noticing unexplained receipts stuffed into the trash, small charges on gas stations or restaurants that didn't match up with his usual habits. One evening while visiting, she slipped into the garage and peeked into his car, finding a crumpled parking ticket from an area far from his office. Another time, when Daniel was distracted, she glanced at his phone on the counter and saw a name she didn't recognize flashing on the screen. She didn't mention any of this to Emily, but the unease built inside her like a storm waiting to break. Her silence, however, was not the same as ignorance. Daniel felt the weight of her suspicion every time their paths crossed. Her gaze lingered too long. Her questions carried too much intention. She no longer treated him with the warmth she once showed, and though she never confronted him openly, her presence made him nervous. He started to dread her visits, convincing himself that each one brought him closer to being exposed. In his mind, Margaret had become the single greatest threat to his carefully managed double life. What made it worse was Daniel's growing paranoia. The longer he maintained the affair, the more desperate he became to keep it hidden. It was no longer just about protecting Emily from heartbreak. For him, it was about preserving the illusion of control. His entire sense of self was tied to the image he projected: a stable husband, a responsible father, a respectable neighbor. If the truth came out, he wouldn't just lose Emily, he would lose the reputation that gave him power in his community. The thought of facing his neighbors, his colleagues, and even his child with the shame of betrayal was unbearable. He felt trapped in a web of his own lies, and the more Margaret's quiet suspicion tightened around him, the more dangerous his thoughts became. He began imagining scenarios where she revealed everything to Emily. He pictured Emily's devastated face, her voice breaking as she told him to leave. He envisioned the judgment of those around him, whispers spreading through the neighborhood, co-workers losing respect for him. These imagined consequences became as real as the affair itself. He convinced himself that Margaret would not stop until she had destroyed him. Her silence, instead of calming him, only made his fear worse. To Daniel, it meant she was planning, waiting for the right moment to shatter his life. The paranoia twisted into darker reasoning. Instead of admitting his mistakes or ending the affair, Daniel started to rationalize that the only way to protect himself was to silence Margaret permanently. The thought terrified him at first, and he tried to push it away, but it always returned stronger each time. At night, lying awake beside Emily, his mind raced with images of confrontation and exposure. By morning, the fear hardened into a cold calculation. If Margaret was the problem, removing her would remove the threat. But almost immediately, another problem surfaced in his mind. If Margaret disappeared under suspicious circumstances, Emily would never forgive him. She would suspect him, hate him, or at the very least, mourn her mother so deeply that their marriage could never be repaired. That realization dragged him into an even darker place. In his twisted logic, Daniel decided that Margaret alone couldn't be the only target. If Emily was still alive after her mother was gone, she would never stop asking questions. She would never let it go, and their marriage would still collapse under the weight of suspicion. To him, the solution became horrifyingly simple. To protect himself fully, he would have to eliminate them both. The thought grew in his mind like a seed taking root. What once seemed unthinkable now became a possibility, then a plan. He told himself it was the only way to maintain control, to prevent the world from discovering the truth. He began to mask his anxiety under a false calm, trying to act as though nothing had changed. He showed Emily small gestures of affection he hadn't bothered with in months, hoping to throw off suspicion. He tried to make Margaret believe he had nothing to hide, though her steady gaze still unsettled him. But behind his calculated smiles, his decision had already been made. What no one could see was how deeply he had slipped into his own paranoia, how far he was willing to go to protect a secret that could have been ended with honesty. Margaret's quiet determination to protect her daughter had unknowingly placed her in grave danger. And Emily, still oblivious to the storm building around her, continued to trust the man who was carefully plotting her destruction. Daniel's plan took shape slowly, built from restless nights and anxious days, where every small detail became part of his strategy. He convinced himself that if he planned carefully enough, no one would ever suspect him. He began by rehearsing stories in his mind, imagining what he would say to neighbors, to police, to Emily's friends if questions ever arose. Each lie felt like a line in a script he would one day perform. His obsession with control grew stronger, and with it came a chilling precision. He knew he couldn't act impulsively. The key was to make everything appear natural, to stage the crime in a way that would look like a tragic accident or a random intrusion. To the outside world, he played the role of the doting husband. He bought flowers for Emily one afternoon, cooked dinner on a weeknight, and even suggested a family outing with their daughter. These small gestures, though unusual for him, were calculated distractions meant to show affection where there was none. He hoped they would later serve as proof of his innocence, as if a man planning to kill his family would also make time to show such kindness. But beneath these acts, his mind remained locked on his dark goal. He took notice of the layout of the house in ways he never had before. The creak of the third step on the staircase, the sound the back door made when it clicked shut, even the thickness of the curtains in the living room became important details to him. He tested how much noise the kitchen drawers made when opened quickly, and how far sound carried from the living room to the upstairs bedroom. His behavior was meticulous, driven not by fear of killing, but by fear of being caught. He imagined the aftermath down to the smallest detail, convinced that if he prepared enough, he could erase suspicion. In his search for control, Daniel also rehearsed his emotions. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror late at night, practicing expressions of grief, panic, and shock. He tested how his voice cracked when he pretended to make a distressed phone call. He studied his reflection, asking himself whether his tears looked convincing enough. In his mind, the crime was not only about survival but also about performance. He had to play the role of the devastated husband who discovered an unspeakable tragedy while hiding the truth that he had created it. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her quiet watch. She noticed the sudden acts of kindness, but didn't buy into them. If anything, his efforts to appear attentive only confirmed her suspicions. She had seen too much already. Though she didn't have solid proof to confront Emily with, her intuition told her Daniel's behavior was not simply the result of stress or fatigue. Margaret began writing down her observations, making small notes she tucked away in her purse. She detailed the strange receipts, the long nights out, the unexplained perfume. She believed she was collecting information for Emily's sake, a way to prepare her daughter for the truth. She feared she would one day have to reveal. What she didn't realize was that her quiet record-keeping was sealing her fate. Daniel noticed her purse more than once, always close by, always carried tightly against her side. His paranoia twisted into certainty that she was hiding evidence against him. He convinced himself that inside it were the keys to his destruction, notes she would one day hand over to Emily in a moment of confrontation. The sight of that purse began to haunt him. Every time she placed it on the table, or carried it into another room, his pulse quickened. He believed that she was one step away from exposing him completely. As days turned into weeks, Daniel's thoughts grew darker and more organized. He selected a Friday evening as the time to carry out his plan. Fridays felt ordinary, and the neighborhood was always quieter as families settled into their weekend routines. He knew Emily would be home, and Margaret would likely be there too, helping with dinner as she often did. He imagined how quickly it could all unfold, how one decisive moment could eliminate the two people standing between him and the preservation of his secret. He prepared the weapon days in advance, a blunt object he kept hidden in the garage under a pile of old boxes. He checked it more than once, each time telling himself it was only a precaution, though in reality he knew it was the tool he intended to use. He rehearsed where he would place it afterward, how he would arrange the scene to suggest someone had broken in. His mind catalogued every possibility, every outcome, as if planning a performance where failure was not an option. The chilling part was not just the act itself, but how ordinary Daniel appeared during these preparations. He still drove to work each morning, still greeted his neighbors with polite nods, still maintained the appearance of normalcy. Yet beneath the calm surface, every interaction was filtered through his plan. Each smile was a mask, each conversation a distraction, while his inner world revolved around the night he intended to kill. He told himself that once it was done, life would return to normal. There would be grief, of course, but he imagined that grief would shield him from suspicion. People would comfort him, his neighbors would see him as a victim, and Emily's absence would silence any threat of exposure. In his mind, it was the perfect solution. What he didn't realize was that the cracks in his plan had already begun to show. The very details he believed would protect him, the staged kindness, the rehearsed emotions, the meticulous arrangements, would later become the pieces that betrayed him. The night Daniel had been preparing for finally arrived. The day itself unfolded like any other, with nothing out of the ordinary to hint at what was about to happen. He went to work, completed a few tasks with little focus, and drove home as if it were routine. His colleagues noticed nothing unusual about him, though in his head every moment was consumed with what he was about to do. He told himself repeatedly that this was the only way, that by the end of the night, his secret would be safe forever. It was no longer a possibility in his mind. It was a necessity. Margaret arrived at the house in the early evening, carrying groceries as she often did. She liked to help Emily with dinner on Fridays, believing that the family time mattered after a long week. Daniel greeted her politely, forcing a smile, his heart pounding harder than usual. Emily thought nothing of it, assuming her husband was tired from work. Dinner preparations began, the clatter of dishes, and the sound of Margaret's voice filling the house. But beneath the ordinary atmosphere, Daniel was already watching every detail with precision. He tracked their movements, noting when Emily was in the kitchen, and when Margaret was alone in the living room. He had rehearsed this moment so many times that it felt inevitable. Margaret settled into the couch while Emily busied herself with chopping vegetables in the kitchen. The air in the house was calm, filled with the faint aroma of food cooking. Daniel slipped away for a moment under the pretense of fetching something from the garage. His heart raced as he uncovered the weapon he had hidden days earlier, gripping it tightly in his hand. The object felt heavier than he remembered, its weight pressing down on him, as though it knew the role it was about to play. He told himself again that this was survival, not choice. He convinced himself that Margaret had left him no other way out. When he returned to the house, the noise from the kitchen masked his movements. Margaret was alone in the living room, absorbed in a magazine she had pulled from the coffee table. She didn't notice him approach until it was too late. With a sudden, calculated force, he struck her from behind. The blow landed with a sickening sound, and Margaret collapsed instantly, the magazine slipping from her hand. The room fell silent except for Daniel's ragged breathing. He stared at her motionless body, the finality of what he had done sinking in with a chilling weight. For a brief moment, the reality nearly overwhelmed him, but he forced it down. He reminded himself that this was only the beginning. The noise drew Emily's attention. She called out, her voice filled with casual concern, unaware of what she was about to walk into. Daniel had no time to hesitate. He turned toward the kitchen as Emily entered the living room, her eyes widening in horror at the sight of her mother. Before she could scream, before she could run, he lunged forward with the same weapon. The first strike caught her off guard, her body crumpling in shock. He continued until the room was still again, the life in both women extinguished by his calculated violence. The house, once filled with ordinary sounds of family life, was now suffocatingly quiet. Daniel stood over them, his hands trembling, his chest heaving with a mix of fear and adrenaline. The plan he had rehearsed so many times had just become reality. He forced himself to move quickly, dragging himself away from the horror he had created and shifting into the role of the planner once more. He scattered drawers in the hallway, knocked over a lamp, and forced a window open to create the illusion of a break-in. He carefully arranged objects to mimic chaos, though the care with which he placed them betrayed the truth of his control. He then cleaned himself up, hiding the weapon back in the garage under layers of junk. He rehearsed what he would say, how his voice would tremble when he called the police, how convincing his shock would sound. He practiced breathing deeply, steadying himself until his voice carried the right balance of panic and despair. Every move was measured, every step calculated to match the script he had rehearsed for weeks. Hours later, he made the call. His words poured out in a frantic tone, telling the dispatcher he had come home to find his wife and mother-in-law brutally attacked. He let his voice crack, even forced tears into his eyes as he waited for police to arrive. When the flashing lights finally illuminated the quiet suburban street, Daniel stood outside, hunched over in apparent devastation, playing the role of the grieving husband. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, whispering in shock at the tragedy that had unfolded so close to home. But even as investigators stepped inside and began their work, small cracks in Daniel's perfect performance began to show. The break-in looked staged, too neat, too careful. The window was open, but there was no broken glass, no signs of forced entry. Nothing valuable had been taken. Despite the apparent struggle, the officers made note of these inconsistencies quietly, even as they offered Daniel words of comfort. The mask he wore was convincing, but beneath it, his lies had already begun to unravel. Detectives began their investigation the moment they stepped into the Harris home. To an untrained eye, the scene could have passed for a violent break-in, but seasoned investigators saw flaws almost immediately. The window Daniel had left ajar was not broken, nor were there any signs that someone had forced their way inside. Dust around the frame was undisturbed, and no footprints marked the ground beneath it. If an intruder had entered, there should have been clearer evidence. Even more suspicious was the fact that nothing valuable was missing. Expensive electronics, wallets, and jewelry remained untouched. The crime scene looked less like a robbery and more like a poorly rehearsed play. As officers examined the home, Daniel continued to perform. He clutched his head in his hands, sobbing loudly, answering questions with a shaky voice, repeating that he had no idea why anyone would target his family. He told them he had returned from running errands to find the horror inside. His words sounded believable on the surface, but investigators noticed how carefully he chose them, how little his story varied from one retelling to the next. Genuine grief usually came out messy and fragmented, but Daniel's words were too smooth, too rehearsed. The autopsy reports provided the first crucial clue. The coroner determined that the blunt force trauma Margaret and Emily suffered suggested a close, targeted attack. The injuries were consistent with an object found within the home, rather than something an intruder might bring. This meant the killer had likely used what was available inside, further weakening Daniel's story of a stranger breaking in. When detectives asked him about the evening, his timeline of events seemed thin, with no outside witnesses to confirm his movements before the alleged discovery of the bodies. Technology added to the mounting suspicion. Phone records revealed that Daniel's device had been active inside the house during the hours he claimed to be away. His attempts to explain it as a mistake or a misreading failed under scrutiny. Investigators also found that several of his internet searches in the weeks prior included phrases about staging break-ins and how police detect lies. Each discovery cut deeper into the illusion he tried so desperately to maintain. The breakthrough came when detectives searched Margaret's belongings. In her purse, they discovered a small notebook filled with handwritten entries. The notes described her suspicions of Daniel's late nights, unexplained expenses, and the strange perfume she had once smelled on his clothing. Margaret had been documenting everything, preparing herself to confront Emily with the truth when she felt ready. Those pages revealed the motive investigators needed. Margaret knew too much, and Daniel had reason to fear exposure. The journal transformed the case from speculation into a story of premeditation and desperation. The evidence built like a puzzle snapping into place. Forensic teams recovered fibers from a pair of gloves Daniel kept in the garage that matched residue on the hidden weapon. His fingerprints were faintly visible on the handle, despite his attempts to clean it. Neighbors recalled seeing him at home during the supposed time he claimed to be out, contradicting his account further. Every piece of the investigation pointed inward, not outward. The break-in narrative collapsed under the weight of facts. When detectives finally confronted him with the evidence, Daniel's carefully crafted performance began to crack. His confidence drained, replaced by agitation and silence. He shifted blame, suggesting unknown enemies or vague intruders, but his explanations only grew more desperate. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was cornered. His obsession with control, the very trait that had driven him to commit the murders, now betrayed him in the interrogation room. He wanted to manipulate the story, but the investigators had already uncovered the truth. He couldn't escape. The trial that followed captivated the community. News outlets filled with headlines about the seemingly ordinary man who had destroyed his own family to protect a secret affair. Neighbors who once waved at Daniel from their porches struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the cold planner described in court. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece. The staged scene, the incriminating searches, the hidden weapon, and Margaret's notes. The jury listened as a picture of deliberate betrayal unfolded before them. Daniel's defense attempted to argue that grief had clouded his memory, and that the evidence was circumstantial, but the overwhelming proof left little room for doubt. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a guilty verdict on both counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole, a punishment reflecting the calculated nature of his crimes and the betrayal of those who trusted him most. Behind bars, Daniel lost everything he had once tried to protect. The affair that had sparked the chain of events dissolved instantly. The woman cutting all ties the moment his arrest became public. His reputation, the image he valued above all else, lay in ruins. Instead of being remembered as the respected husband and father he pretended to be, he became known only as a killer who destroyed his family to hide a truth that would have eventually come out on its own. For the community, the case became a chilling reminder of how easily appearances can deceive. To outsiders, Daniel's life had looked enviable, a model of stability and success. But beneath the facade was a man consumed by paranoia and pride, willing to cross the darkest line to protect himself. In the end, his lies could not save him, and the silence he forced upon Margaret and Emily only amplified the truth of his guilt. His story closed not with control, but with confinement, leaving behind a legacy of tragedy that no one in the quiet suburb would ever forget.